Imagine you're on the American frontier in the 1870s. You've been traveling for days along the Osage Trail in southeast Kansas, a lonely, unforgiving ribbon of dirt stretching across an endless sea of grass. You're tired, you're hungry, and as the sun bleeds out across the horizon, you see it, a single light flickering in the distance, a promise of warmth, a hot meal, and a safe place to rest your head. You pull up to a crude, 16 by 24-foot cabin with a hand-lettered sign that just says groceries. The door opens, and you're greeted by a smile from an uncommonly handsome young woman with dark hair and hazel eyes. This is Kate Bender, and she invites you in. She offers you the seat of honor at the dinner table, the one with its back against a heavy canvas curtain that divides the small room. As you eat, she dazzles you with conversation about spiritualism, healing, and free love. You relax. You feel safe. You don't notice the figures moving silently behind the curtain. You don't hear the hammer being raised. The next thing you know, a trapdoor beneath you scrapes open, and you're dropped into a dark, stinking cellar, where a knife finishes the job. On the American frontier, hospitality could get you killed. But who were these hosts? And how did they turn their humble inn into a human slaughterhouse? This is the story of the Bloody Benders, America's first and most mysterious serial killer family. Annoyed, the Bloody Prairie. To understand how the Benders got away with murder for at least 2 years, you have to understand the world they lived in. Post-Civil War Kansas was a chaotic, violent, and hopeful place. The Homestead Act of 1862 had brought a flood of settlers west to claim their 160 acres. The state was a magnet for ex-soldiers from both sides, newly freed African Americans known as exodusters, and immigrants from all over the world, all looking for a fresh start. One historian called it a hotbed for radical individuals. The Benders set up their shop right on the Osage Trail, a major artery for westward expansion that ran from Fort Scott to Independence. This wasn't some forgotten back road. It was a highway of dreams, used by thousands of settlers, including, for a time, the family of Laura Ingalls Wilder of Little House on the Prairie fame. For the Benders, this trail was a conveyor belt, delivering a steady stream of potential victims right to their doorstep. And in this world, people just disappeared. A lot. Law enforcement was sparse, and justice was often a DIY affair, handled by vigilance committees. When a traveler went missing, it was easy to assume they'd fallen victim to bandits, died from disease, gotten lost in a blizzard, or had a run-in with local Native American tribes. The vast, unforgiving landscape was the perfect accomplice to murder. It was a haystack of chaos and transience, and the Benders were the deadliest needle you could ever imagine. The family that prays together. So, who were these people? Officially, they were the Bender family, German immigrants who settled their claim in 1870. There was John, Bender Sr., or Pa, his wife Elvira, or Ma, and their 2 adult children, John Jr. and Kate, except they probably weren't a family at all. And this is my first controversial take. The Bender family was a carefully constructed lie, a piece of social camouflage designed to make them seem like a normal, God-fearing, homesteading unit. Neighbors whispered that John Jr. and Kate seemed more like husband and wife, and modern researchers largely agree. The most likely theory is that Ma and Kate were the only blood relatives, a mother-daughter duo. Pa was probably just one of Ma's many former husbands, and John Jr. was Kate's common-law husband, a con artist named John Gebhardt. Posing as a traditional family simply raised less questions on the frontier. Pa Bender, around 60, was described as a repulsive, hideous brute, without a redeeming trait, dirty, profane, and ill-tempered. He stood over 6 feet tall and spoke in a guttural German accent so thick it was nearly impossible to understand. A neighbor called her a dirty old Dutch crone, whose face was a fit picture of the midnight hag that wove the spell murderous ambition about the soul of Macbeth. She was notoriously unfriendly, and rumors swirled that she'd murdered several of her previous husbands, though that was never proven. John Jr., about 25, was an odd one. He was handsome, but had a habit of laughing aimlessly, which led many to think he was a half-wit. But when he got excited, that facade dropped, and one observer said he recalled the grave-robbing hyena at once to mind. His simpleton routine was likely just an act to disarm visitors. 23-year-old Kate Bender was the star of the show. She was the polar opposite of her grim, withdrawn family. She was attractive, intelligent, charming, and outgoing. She was the public face of the Bender Inn, the lure that drew travelers in. But Kate was more than just a pretty face. She was a radical, a proto-feminist of the prairie who pushed back hard against the Victorian ideals of feminine domesticity and submission. She styled herself Professor Miss Katie Bender, and was a practicing spiritualist and healer who held seances in the cabin. She handed out flyers advertising her supernatural powers and gave lectures where she advocated for free love. This wasn't just a quirky side hustle, it was an integral part of the murder operation. In an era when spiritualism was a legitimate, if eccentric movement, it gave strangers a perfect reason to visit their isolated home. And under the guise of a psychic reading, she could charm a man into revealing his life story, his travel plans, and most importantly, how much money he was carrying. In her lectures, she even argued that murder might be a dictation for good. She was hiding in plain sight, using her charisma and unconventional beliefs as the perfect cover for a monster. Murder ritual? The Benders' cabin wasn't just a home, it was a purpose-built slaughterhouse. The single room was divided by a heavy canvas wagon cover, separating the public store from the private living quarters. This curtain was the key to their whole operation. Here's how it worked. A lone traveller, preferably with a full wallet, would be invited in for a meal. They were always given the seat of honour at the dinner table, the one with its back pressed right up against that canvas curtain. While the guest ate, thoughtful Kate would work her magic, flirting and talking, sizing them up. Was he alone? Did he have family nearby expecting him? Was he carrying cash? Once she confirmed he was a suitable target, she'd give a signal. Behind the curtain, Pa and John Jr. were waiting. On Kate's signal, one of them would swing a heavy hammer, crushing the back of the guest's skull through the canvas. Excel. No mess. No struggle. The stunned or dead victim was then immediately dropped through a trapdoor in the floor into a 6-foot-deep, stone-lined cellar. Down in the darkness, their throat was slit from ear to ear to finish the job and bleed the body out. Some accounts claim it was Kate herself, the charming hostess, who would descend into the pit to deliver this final, brutal cut. Then the family would descend on the body like a flock of vultures, stripping it of cash, valuables, and even clothes. Later that night, under the cover of darkness, the men would drag the body out to the apple orchard behind the cabin and bury it in a shallow grave. And in the most chilling detail of this whole grotesque story, local legend says that Ma Bender would use the apples from that very orchard, an orchard fertilized by the bodies of their victims, to bake pies for their next unsuspecting guests. The Benders perfected this system, turning their home into a factory of death, but they were about to make a fatal mistake. They killed a man whose brother refused to let him just disappear. Before we get to the man who brought down America's first serial killer family, excited, do me a favor and hammer that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. You won't want to miss our next trip into history's darkest corners. The Colonel's Justice. It all started in the winter of 1872 with the disappearance of a man named George Newton Longcore. He was a young widower, his wife having died shortly after giving birth to their daughter Mary Ann. Heartbroken, he was taking his 18-month-old child back to his parents' home in Iowa to start over. They never made it. In the spring of 1873, their concerned neighbor, a respected local physician named Dr. William York, set out to retrace their steps. He, too, vanished. Now, this is where the Benders messed up. Dr. York wasn't some anonymous drifter. His brother was Colonel Alexander M. York, a decorated Civil War veteran, a lawyer, and a powerful Kansas state senator. Unlike the families of the other victims, Colonel York had the influence, the resources, and the sheer force of will to tear the county apart looking for his brother. On March 28, 1873, Colonel York and another man arrived at the Bender Inn. The Benders played it cool, admitting Dr. York had stopped by, but suggesting he probably ran into trouble with Indians. York was suspicious, but left. He returned on April 3rd, this time with a group of armed men. He'd heard a story about a woman who had recently fled the inn in terror after Ma Bender threatened her with knives. When York confronted them, Ma, who usually pretended to barely speak English, flew into a rage and unleashed a tirade in perfect fluent English, ordering them out of her house. The mask had slipped. The local community was now on high alert. A township meeting was called at the Harmony Grove schoolhouse to organize a search of every single homestead in the area. In a move of pure, chilling audacity, John Bender Jr. reportedly attended that meeting, listening as the community laid out its plans to find the bodies he had helped bury. The Benders knew the game was up. Sometime after that meeting, they packed what they could, abandoned their starving animals, and vanished into the night, leaving a half-eaten meal on the table, as if they'd just stepped out for a moment. A few days later, a neighbor noticed the eerie silence at the Bender place and raised the alarm. Colonel York assembled a search party of several hundred volunteers and descended on the property. Inside the cabin, a foul odor hung in the air. They traced it to a trapdoor under a bed, which had been nailed shut. Prying it open, they found the cellar. The floor was caked in clotted blood, but there were no bodies. The search moved outside to the freshly ploughed vegetable garden and apple orchard. A man began probing the soft soil with a metal rod. He hit something. They started digging. The first body they unearthed was Dr. William York. What followed was a scene from a nightmare. Over the next day, the search party dug up grave after grave. The final count was staggering. They found George Longcore and his 18-month-old daughter Mary Ann buried together in a single grave. The little girl had no marks on her body. It's believed she was either strangled or, horrifyingly, buried alive. The discovery became a national sensation. Newspapers from New York to Chicago ran lurid headlines, calling the Bender farm Hell's Half-Acre and the Devil's Kitchen, and with the headlines came the birth of a phenomenon we know all too well today: murder tourism. Special trains were chartered to bring thousands of Gawkers to the site. These weren't mourners, they were thrill seekers. They swarmed the property while bodies were still being pulled from the ground, and they tore the cabin apart piece by piece, taking home splinters of wood and clumps of blood-soaked dirt as ghoulish souvenirs. The public's morbid fascination with true crime isn't new. It was born right there, in a bloody apple orchard in Kansas. Ghosts on the prairie. So what happened to the Benders? They were never caught. The state of Kansas offered a $2,000 reward, that's over $50,000 today, for their capture, but it was never claimed. They simply vanished. Over the years, three main theories have emerged. The first, and most popular, is the vigilante justice theory. The story goes that a posse of enraged locals caught up with the Benders, held a quick trial by gunfire, and dumped their bodies in the Verdigris River. It's a clean, satisfying ending where the monsters get what they deserve. Several people even came forward years later claiming to have been part of the lynch mob. The second theory is the Great Escape. This theory holds that the Benders, being professional criminals, simply outsmarted everyone. They had a head start, split up, changed their names, and melted back into the American landscape. For the next 50 years, there were dozens of false sightings and wrongful arrests. In 1889, 2 women were even arrested in Michigan and put on trial for being Ma and Kate Bender, before it was proven they were the wrong people. The third theory, favored by modern researcher Susan Jonassas, is that they met their end at the hands of other outlaws, perhaps in the violent, lawless territory of Texas, where they were rumored to have fled. So, what do I think happened? Here's my final controversial take. The vigilante story is a nice, clean ending, but it feels too much like frontier folklore. It's the story people wanted to be true. If a posse had really killed them, That $50,000 reward would have been too tempting. Somebody would have talked. No, my money is on the Great Escape. These weren't crazed, impulsive killers. They were a methodical, disciplined criminal enterprise. Remember the rumors about Ma killing her old husbands? This probably wasn't their first rodeo. They knew how to disappear because they'd likely done it before. I believe they split up. Kate and John Jr. went one way, the old couple another. And they never stopped killing. Somewhere out there, in another dusty town, under a different name, they opened another roadside inn, and the disappearances started all over again. The most terrifying part of the Bender story isn't the dozen murders we know about, it's the ones we never will. The Benders vanished like ghosts into the prairie they terrorized, leaving behind a legacy of blood and a mystery that's still debated 150 years later. What do you think happened to them? Were they caught and killed by a posse, or did they escape to kill again? Let me know your theory in the comments below. If you enjoyed this dive into one of America's darkest historical crimes, be sure to like this video and subscribe for more stories from the edge of history. Thanks for watching.